In today's episode, we're going to look at the psychology found in Pixar films. We're going to look at a number of different films and specifically point out three areas that we can draw out rich psychological principles. We're going to look at a growth mindset. We're going to explore acceptance and mindfulness and how to deal with your emotions. And then we're going to finally wrap it up with this concept of positive psychology and how to find meaning in life. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, a licensed professional counselor, and this is Psych Cinema. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. Before we get started, do me a favor, subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out any time we drop new content that explores the rich intersection of pop culture and psychology. Now, I recently dropped an episode exploring specifically the Toy Story franchise, so I'm not really going to highlight a lot of that film in today's episode. But Pixar really does a phenomenal job of infusing strong psychological principles within their stories, but in a way that doesn't make it very preachy or kind of lectury, but for either those that struggle with their own mental health or people in the mental health profession. Pixar films really use psychology and mental health to drive the narrative and the character development forward. So I'm going to look at this idea of a mindset, explore acceptance and mindfulness, and then finally wrap up with positive psychology. But let's start with this idea of mindset. And there is a psychologist named Carol Dweck who's done research for 30 plus years on the idea of a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And a fixed mindset is really when someone believes that their strengths, their abilities are fixed and predetermined. In a lot of ways that can really hamper people when it comes to changing their effort or what do they do when they face adversity, failure, or setback. But when we think about someone with a growth mindset, is that they look at their qualities and characteristics and they believe that they're malleable through experiences and effort. And so whether it's adversity, failure, or setback, they can learn from them, they can grow from them, and they can change their future outcomes. And so we see that principle at play in a lot of Pixar films, but I want to specifically point out three. First, if we look at A Bug's Life, and you look at Flick, who makes a lot of mistakes early in the film, but through his hero's journey, he's able to change and learn and grow. We look at Brave, which really has more about to do with traditions, but you see how characters are able to change and not feel restricted to traditions, the status quo, or the way things have always been. But I think one of the greatest illustrations of a growth mindset really comes in the Incredibles franchise, Incredibles 1 and 2. When you think about Bob and Helen, Mr. Incredible, or Elastigirl, you see from the first film all the way to the conclusion of Incredibles 2 how they've had to really change and adapt as life has progressed, whether it be that superheroes are outlawed and they have to go back into domestic roles, whether it be in the second film where it's really Elastigirl that takes on the prominent lead role, and Bob has to really shift to become more of a supportive role, but also become more of an active father figure in his kids' upbringing. You see how they really are able to demonstrate this growth mindset. And you see some adjustment and some frustration, but eventually they're able to really find their groove in those different roles and how life has changed. And so that's really about growth mindset. But let's switch now to this idea of acceptance and mindfulness. And I want to specifically call out a theoretical approach in counseling and psychology known as acceptance and commitment therapy. And what that really is that it's a third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy. But one of its main principles is to not shy away from negative emotions, but create space for them rather than overreact and try to make judgments about them or to really activate into problem solving and elimination mode. They really focus more on pursuing valued behaviors rather than hyper-focusing on emotions and getting rid of them. And there are two films that I believe do a great job in demonstrating how we deal with emotions from an acceptance and a mindfulness matter. The first would be the Finding Dory and Finding Nemo in terms of just anxiety and fear. And you see how in those films that it really drives a lot of people's choices and decisions. When we see Marlin, who's just so overwhelmed with fear and anxiety about Nemo that he really restricts his ability to kind of interact with others and go too far because he's so afraid of something bad would happen to him. And by the end of the film, he still has that parental anxiety, but he recognizes that just because he feels it doesn't mean he has to act on it. He doesn't have to restrict or limit Nemo's life. But then we think about Pixar's Inside Out, which really specifically focused on the inner dynamics of emotions. And in that film, really, we come to this conclusion where the girl is able to say to her parents that, if I feel sad, it's okay. That there's nothing inherently wrong about feeling negative or unwanted emotions, nor does it mean that we automatically have to pulverize them and eradicate them. That's part of being human, is to feel this whole gamut of emotions. And that if we can just create space that we can live and feel those emotions, that then we can still, in a lot of ways, kind of direct our focus on valued behaviors and what we want to do with life, rather than negative emotions halt us, and that's all we can focus on and consume. And that really, I think, kind of weaves in perfectly to this last psychological principle of positive psychology. And positive psychology really is designed to complement traditional psychology, which is more of a medical model. The medical model of psychology is to really focus on the dysfunction, the problem. And that's just the medical model in general, whereas we know in psychology, we know in mental health that there are just some things that are not fully in our control or are never eliminated. So in a lot of ways, it's about how do you learn to live with them and not feel like your value, your identity, or your quality of life is completely determined by dysfunction or mental illness or trauma, things along those lines. And that's really where positive psychology comes in. Positive psychology, a lot of people have this misunderstanding of what it really represents. They hear the word positive and think about just being happy and just being optimistic. And that's really not the case at all. Positive psychology is really about, instead of just focusing on the negative, especially things that you can't change or have no control over, how do we open ourselves up to also look for things that bring great value and meaning and joy and purpose in life? That's really at the core of positive psychology. And we see that in a number of Pixar films as well. I think the greatest representation of positive psychology would be the film Up, with Mr. Fredricksen, who's lost his beloved spouse. And he's experiencing tremendous grief and loss, and he feels in a lot of ways incomplete moving forward without his partner. And yet, here we are, we're able to see that he can find new meaning, new connection and purpose in the midst of dealing with grief and loss, that it doesn't have to be so mutually exclusive, that he's either in the throes of deep pain or he has to be just happy and satisfied in life. He's able to find something positive and meaningful at that stage of life. Another example would be Ratatouille, where we look at Remy and how, even though he feels like himself or the rest of the world is going to look down on him because he is a rat, he has this passion and desire to be a chef and to cook and be adventurous. And he, in a lot of ways, doesn't let either those limitations, the stigma, or stereotypes against him limit his ability to pursue that, because he truly believes that that's going to bring him great purpose and value in his life. So as you can see by the great wealth of Pixar films and how we can draw out a lot of principles of psychology and mental health, that they really know what they're doing in looking inward and what motivates us as humans and how we respond to stories and adversity. But I'm interested to hear from you, because I really only touched on a few films. What are some other examples of Pixar films that you believe really highlight strong psychological principles and themes? Be sure to leave your comments below. You can also leave us a recommendation of a film you would like for us to tackle here on Psych Cinema. You can follow me on Twitter, and be sure to check out shrinktank.com, where you're going to find other videos, articles, podcasts, and more that explore the rich intersection of psychology and pop culture. Be sure to check out on shrinktank.com. We have the hardest Pixar quiz you're ever going to take. And we also have my ranking of the Pixar films, where I really just kind of give you my take on which ones that I think are the best versus some of the lower quality Pixar films. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Jonathan Hetterly, and I'll see you at the movies.